Winter 1991, Northa District, Heilongjiang Province. The night was brutally cold, so cold that even the sounds seemed to freeze in place. In a dim, near-empty police outpost, a telephone rang long and urgent. The officer on duty picked up. "Qiangnan Police here. We need your help. We've got multiple dead, at least 20. It's bad." Within minutes, the team in Northa was moving. They followed the address provided, arriving at an old compound, its iron doors sealed shut with ice. What happened next would burn itself into the memory of every officer there. The basement door was forced open. At first, just darkness and the stale, heavy air of something that had been hidden too long. Then came the stench, thick, undeniable, violent. And then the bodies, piled, layered, twisted, some rotting beyond recognition. Others chillingly fresh. A dozen officers retched on the spot. One collapsed, another screamed. Not one of them had seen anything like this. No one had prepared for this kind of horror. 42 corpses jammed into a narrow underground chamber, their stories erased until now. The next morning, headlines exploded. Mass grave discovered in Northa. Serial killer may be involved. And the words that spread like wildfire across town. If you don't want to live, go to Northa. I can't help but wonder, how could something like this go unnoticed for so long? How many people walked past that house never suspecting what lay just beneath the floor? And what kind of person, no, what kind of monster, could do something like this? Let's find out. In early 1990, the town of Northa, quiet, rural, forgotten, began to change. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just the small things. A girl didn't come home from work. A neighbor who was usually chatty hadn't been seen in days. A young man who frequently took the morning train gone. People started noticing, but they didn't talk much. Life had a way of pressing forward, especially in places where hardship was normal. But underneath that forced normalcy, there was fear. By mid-1990, the number of disappearances quietly stacked up. Most were young women in their early 20s. Some were students, others factory workers. Some were said to be kind, others, pretty others, just vulnerable. What connected them was that they were gone, and no one seemed to know where they'd gone. Families searched, flyers were posted, but no major investigation happened. Local officials wrote them off as runaways or migrants. The truth, however, was far darker. Fast forward to late 1991. In the freezing cold of November, officers from Northa, now working with counterparts from the southern city of Qiangnan, uncover the unthinkable. More than 40 bodies packed into a basement. The forensic team was called in immediately. Even the bitter winter air couldn't mask the overwhelming stench of decay. Inside that basement, layers of death were uncovered. Some corpses had turned to bone. Others were in advanced stages of decomposition. Insects had eaten away much of the flesh. Mold clung to clothing. The bodies weren't buried, just stacked, like cargo. But this wasn't just the work of some reckless killer. No. Investigators began to suspect planning, pattern, strategy. A mass murder, they concluded. A deliberate and organized campaign of killing. The media caught on. Word spread quickly. Local newspapers labeled it a twisted case, the worst the province had seen in decades. On television, grim-faced anchors delivered updates that only made the fear grow. A few brave journalists tried to uncover who the victims were. It turned out, many had been missing for months, some for over a year. Several had been reported but ignored. When DNA testing began, it revealed something devastating. These weren't just statistics. These were daughters, sons, co-workers, people whose families had begged someone, anyone, to listen. I can't help but ask, how many lives could have been saved if someone had taken those early warnings seriously? Back in Northa, the public's trust in local police collapsed overnight. Panic set in. Parents began locking their daughters indoors. People whispered that the killer might still be around, maybe even watching them. Some stopped going to the markets. Others slept with knives beneath their pillows. Rumors were everywhere. One in particular refused to die. If you don't want to live, go to Northa. In response, the authorities finally launched a special investigative unit, dozens of officers, forensic scientists, and behavioral experts from across the province. Their mission was clear catch whoever did this before they strike again. But there was a problem. They had no suspects, no fingerprints, no DNA, no eyewitnesses, no leads. Just 42 bodies, a rotting basement, and a trail that had long since gone cold. So they did what desperate investigators do. They began knocking on doors. Every ex-con, every wanderer, every person with a record or a missing alibi was questioned. Interviews ran day and night. Some officers slept in their cars. Others missed birthdays, anniversaries, entire holidays. Still nothing. But that would soon change. Because hundreds of miles away, at a bustling train station in Hangzhou, an off-duty officer was about to spot something strange, something small, something easy to overlook. And yet that one strange moment would break the case wide open. October 1991, Hangzhou train station. It was late past 10 p.m. The autumn heat still clung to the air and the crowds hadn't yet thinned. Beneath the fluorescence of the terminal lights, Officer Wang, off-duty but ever alert, watched the evening unfold. And then he saw her. A young woman, maybe in her early 20s. Short hair, soft face, dressed in an oversized sweater too thick for the weather. She stood awkwardly beside a man who looked off. His mannerisms were stiff, predatory even. Tanned skin, greasy hair, southern accent. Something about the way he looked at her like she was a purchase, not a person, made Wang's instincts tingle. Wang didn't act immediately. He just followed discreetly. The pair exited the station and slipped into a narrow alley behind the freight lot. Then something even stranger happened. 3 more men, bulky and cold-eyed, began tailing them. 2 looked like construction workers. The third was younger, with sharp features and pale skin. They kept their distance, but never lost sight. Wang radioed for backup. Moments later, Officer Li and 3 more plainclothes agents joined him, armed and ready. The young woman led the man into a side alley. Then the trio pounced. They shoved the man against the wall, shouting accusations of assault. One pulled out a knife, another demanded compensation. It was a scam, a classic extortion trick using a female decoy. Or so it seemed. The team moved fast. Officer Wang drew his weapon and called out police. Drop the knife. The gang froze. The blade hit the ground. Cuffs clicked. The nightmare was over, at least for the man they tried to rob. But for police, it was just beginning. At the precinct, the 3 men claimed innocence. They said they were just teaching a pervert a lesson. The woman they insisted was someone's wife. The IDs they presented, all fake. One officer quietly noted criminals often lie. But this feels like something deeper. Then came the twist. The young woman, shaking pale, terrified, asked to use the restroom. Officer Li handed her a hygiene kit. Inside the stall, she slipped a folded paper note beneath the door. It read, "Please help me. I'm being forced to kill." Let that sink in. Forced to kill. The note sent chills down every spine in that station. She identified herself as Tu Lihua, age 23, a former preschool teacher, a victim, a pawn, and if what she said was true, an unwilling accomplice to a series of murders. Tu confessed that she had been trapped in a ring of killers led by a man named Jia Wenge, a charming factory worker turned butcher turned predator. The gang's method was simple. 2 would lure men from public places. Once inside their trap house, they'd be ambushed, killed, and robbed. The authorities didn't believe it at first, until 2 gave them the address. A rundown property just outside Northa. The same one, yes, the very same where the basement was found. Within hours, Northa police received the tip. A special task force surrounded the home. Inside, they found evidence confirming 2's story. Bloodstains beneath the floorboards, burnt ID cards, jewelry, shoes, hairbrushes, toothbrushes. Things no one would leave behind unless they never planned to leave at all. And in the freezer, remains, human remains, bagged, labeled, and hidden in ice. Jia Wenge wasn't there, but he wouldn't stay gone for long. Over the next week, detectives tracked phone records, intercepted conversations, and mapped travel patterns. Every detail Tu provided proved true, and then they caught a break. A toll booth worker in Hangzhou recognized Jia's face from a bulletin. said he'd passed through with a woman and child. The net was closing, but let's go back to Tu Lihua because her role in this is more complex than it seems. According to her statement, she never chose this life. She met Jia after being thrown out of her home by an abusive partner. He offered her food, shelter, kindness, said his parents lived with him, said he'd help her start fresh. Instead, she was drugged, violated, and locked in a basement surrounded by corpses. Jia offered her one way out. Help me, or become one of them. So she helped, out of fear, out of trauma, out of some desperate hope to survive. Some people believe she was just as guilty. Others think she was a victim of monstrous manipulation. I can't help but wonder, what would you have done? When survival costs your soul, can you ever truly be innocent? When police finally cornered and arrested Jia Wenge, they found him in a borrowed apartment in Kangzhou, lying shirtless on a floor mat watching television with a child asleep nearby. He didn't resist. He didn't speak. He simply stood up, stretched, and said, I knew this would come. But no one, not even the seasoned investigators who had seen war zones and gangland murders, was prepared for what Jia Wenge would eventually admit. Born in 1960 to a poor farming family in rural Heilongjiang, Jia's life was hard from the start. His parents died when he was just a teenager. With no guidance, no supervision, he dropped out of school and bounced around labor jobs. Despite a lack of education, he was intelligent, street smart, and attractive. By the time he was 25, Jia had become something of a local charmer. Good looks, smooth talk, easy laughter. Women liked him, he knew it, and he used it. He worked at an agricultural processing plant in Northa where he quickly gained a reputation for flirting and fast talking. But beneath that charm was a quiet cruelty. When confronted by management for inappropriate relationships with multiple women, some married, he didn't apologize. He laughed. Days later, he was fired. That was the moment everything changed. According to Tu Lihua's testimony, Jia began hunting soon after. He moved into a rundown property near the train station and recruited two other individuals, Liu Tao, a rugged ex-factory worker, and Sun Lian, a timid but loyal acquaintance from his gambling circles. Together they formed what police would later describe as a traveling execution team. Each had a role. Tu Lihua lured men. Liu Tao secured the location. Sun Lian cleaned up and managed stolen goods. And Jia did the killing. Victims were often promised a drink, a night of comfort, a meal. Once inside, they were ambushed, stripped, and stabbed. Some were beaten, others were strangled. Occasionally, Jia used an axe. The weapons changed, the outcome never did. But what horrified investigators most wasn't just the murder, it was what came after. Reports show that Jia would sometimes keep the bodies in the house for days, sleeping in the same room. On occasion, it's alleged he would mutilate the corpses. Organs were removed, genitalia severed. One report, unconfirmed but consistent across multiple testimonies, suggested Jia cooked and consumed portions of his victims. He never denied it. When asked, he simply replied, "You wouldn't understand." Psychologists brought in to evaluate him described his behavior as predatory, narcissistic, and ritualistic. One noted that Jia didn't kill for money. He killed for power. In interrogation, Jia showed little remorse. He couldn't recall the names of the victims. When pressed for details, he shrugged. There were many, he said, maybe 30, maybe more. The official count would be 42 confirmed deaths. Police suspect the real number may be higher. Among the victims were both men and women, though most were young women between the ages of 18 and 30. Some had been reported missing. Others never were transients, workers far from home, people no one came looking for. Their bodies were stuffed into the basement of that Northa property. Each one a story lost in silence. So what about the others? Liu Tao, the enforcer, confessed after 3 days in isolation. He claimed Jia manipulated him, said he never wanted to kill just to help collect debt. Police didn't buy it. His fingerprints were on 6 murder weapons. Sun Lian wept through his confession, said he thought it was all just for show until he saw Jia slit a man's throat in front of him. By then he was too afraid to leave. And then there was Tu Lihua. Her case divided the room. Some investigators saw her as a full-fledged accomplice. After all, she lured victims. She dressed the part. She didn't run. Others believed she was a victim, controlled, abused, trapped by threats to her family. Tu herself said, "I died the night he brought me into that house. I just didn't know it yet." Legally, the court would eventually classify her as an accessory to multiple murders under duress, a rare charge, and one that would shape her fate in the trial to come. Jia, however, had no ambiguity, no defense. His only statement to the press was this: "People die every day. I just helped them get there faster. I don't know about you, but I can't help but ask, what turns a man into this? A child abandoned, a worker discarded, a man who decided the world owed him and took lives to balance the scales." January 1992, Northa. Snow had started to fall again, soft flakes blanketing the roads leading to the People's Court. But the cold outside was nothing compared to the chill inside the courtroom. Jia Wenge, Liu Tao, Sun Lian, and Tu Lihua were led in shackled, silent eyes downcast. The room was packed. Survivors, journalists, relatives of the dead. Some wept openly. Others stared at Jia with quiet rage. According to the official indictment, between March 1989 and October 1991, the accused were responsible for 42 confirmed homicides, 18 male victims, 24 female, all murdered in a premeditated manner, all for personal gain, revenge, or simply because they could. Some were stabbed, others bludgeoned. A few were poisoned. One victim prosecutors alleged was tortured for days before finally being killed. And yet when asked how many people he'd murdered, Jia Wenge simply replied, "I stopped counting." Police had secured overwhelming evidence. Forensic DNA from bones found in the basement. Witness testimonies including Tu Lihua's full confession. Surveillance footage from train stations. A bloody axe. Forged IDs traced back to multiple victims. And hundreds of personal belongings, watches, purses, shoes that matched missing persons cases from over a dozen cities. But the most damning evidence, Jia himself. He didn't deny the charges. He didn't apologize. In fact, when asked during court if he had anything to say to the families of his victims, he said, "They were weak. Weak people die." The courtroom gasped. Even the judge, hardened by years of brutal cases, took a moment before continuing. The prosecution requested capital punishment for all four, but there was debate around Tu Lihua. Her lawyer argued that she acted under coercion, that she was raped, threatened, and mentally imprisoned by Jia. The court reviewed psychological evaluations that described her as suffering from severe trauma fear conditioning and long-term coercive control. Still, her role in luring at least 10 victims could not be ignored. After 2 days of deliberation, the sentence was read. Jia Wenge, death penalty, immediate execution. Liu Tao, death penalty. Sun Lian, death penalty. Tu Lihua, death penalty, with a recommendation for psychological review before finalization. No one celebrated, no one cheered. The victims' families didn't clap or cry out. Most just sat there quietly, clutching old photos as if hoping for a different ending. But the truth was, their loved ones were never coming back. On January 9, 1992, all four were taken in armored vehicles through the streets of Northa. The public procession was intentional, a signal from the government that justice had been served. Jia showed no fear. He even smirked at one point as the crowd spat and cursed at him. He refused a blindfold. He refused last words. He simply said, "Let's get this over with." Minutes later, the sentence was carried out. It was over. But for the people of Northa, closure would take much longer. Rumors began circulating that the real number of victims wasn't 42, but closer to 60. Some bodies, they said, had been burned. Others dissolved. A few may have been foreigners passing through on visas never reported missing. And then there were the whispers. The basement wasn't the only one. No evidence ever confirmed that claim. But in a town that had been so wrong so many times, rumors carried weight. Today, the building where the murders occurred no longer exists. It was demolished months after the trial. In its place now stands a small community park. But if you visit on January 9th, you'll find candles lined up along the edge of the grass, photos taped to trees, names carved into stone. And every year, a crowd gathers to remember not the killers, but the lives they took. Because in Northa, they don't speak Jia Wenge's name anymore. They speak the names of his victims. Years have passed. The snow still falls in Northa. The streets have changed. Children play where nightmares once stood, but the scars, they remain. What do you do after a town witnesses something like this? How do you go on living when your neighbor turned out to be a killer? When your daughter's friend simply vanished one night only to be found months later beneath someone's floorboards? For the people of Northa, there was no roadmap for grief, no guide for rebuilding trust. They simply had to endure and remember. Every year on January 9th, the townspeople gather in silence, not to commemorate Jia Wenge or his crimes, but to honor the 42 lives taken. They light candles, say prayers, tell stories. For many families, that day has become their only moment of collective healing. Some still bring the last photo they had of their loved one. Some bring nothing at all, just presence, just memory. The old compound where the murders took place is gone now. In its place stands Remembrance Park, a modest stretch of grass and stone. But locals say if you walk the grounds alone on a quiet day, you can feel something heavy in the air, like the ground itself remembers what was buried there. Tulihua's story remains controversial. Some view her as a tragic figure, a woman whose life was hijacked by a predator. Others say she made choices, deadly ones, and that fear is no excuse. Her final appeal was denied. She was executed alongside the others. To this day, her name appears in conversations like a question that can't be answered. Jia Wenge's name, meanwhile, has been largely erased from public life. In schools, he is not mentioned. In textbooks, the case is summarized in just a few lines, sanitized, distant. The horror, they say, is too much for young minds. But horror ignored is horror repeated. That's why we tell these stories. Not to sensationalize them, not to glorify killers, but to remember what happens when warnings go unheeded, when victims go unheard, when evil wears a human face and walks unnoticed among us. In the wake of the case, reforms were pushed at the local and provincial levels. Missing persons reports were centralized. Rural police outposts were given more resources. Psychological profiling units were expanded. Small changes too late for the 42 lives lost, but perhaps just in time for someone else. Still, some questions remain. Why did it take so long to notice how many others were involved but never caught? And most haunting of all, could something like this happen again? You might think the answer is no, that this was a one-time thing, a perfect storm of poverty, trauma, and madness. But the truth is, monsters rarely look like monsters. They look like us. And sometimes, they live next door. I can't help but feel there's a deeper tragedy here. Not just the deaths, but the way fear silenced a town for so long. How many people suspected something, but said nothing? If there's anything to take away from this, it's this. If your gut says something's wrong, listen. If someone disappears, ask louder. If your neighbor's basement smells like death, don't ignore it. Because silence doesn't just protect the innocent. Sometimes it protects the guilty. Now we'd like to hear from you. Do you think Tu Lihua was a victim or an accomplice? And how would your town have responded? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story stayed with you, share it, so the silence doesn't win.